We've got the Children's Hospital, which ran into billions of an overrun as well. I didn't hear anybody say that it wasn't the right thing to do to bail them out. That's how things work. Like, if we go down this road here, where do we stop? We've got people in Donegal and Mayo and other affected counties. There's 6 affected counties so far, and more yet to be discovered.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 133 for the 21st of April, 2022. I was talking to Billy Kelleher in the last podcast about Ukraine and the West's reaction, and in particular the attitude of MEPs Claire Daly and Mick Wallace. Naomi O'Leary, the Irish Times journalist, started an epic Twitter discussion over Easter about the contrasting attitude of Wallace and Daly to authoritarian regimes and to the West. My attitude to this is pretty simple. It's that two separate things can be true at the same time. It can be true that the West is responsible for gross human rights abuses, resource extraction, environmental destruction in other parts of the world. It can be possible to condemn that while still acknowledging that there are totalitarian regimes in different parts of the world that are worthy of being condemned and are in fact much, much worse. Saying that they're worse doesn't undermine condemnations of actions by Western governments that are bad, just not on the whole as bad. And condemning the abuses by Western governments doesn't undermine criticism of authoritarian governments elsewhere. Any attempt to calculate a hierarchy of inhumanity leads straight to nonsense. But what I'm concerned about today, and what cropped up on many of the negative replies to Naomi O'Leary's article on Twitter, was a cohort of people who seemed to think that they had some special insight into Vladimir Putin's inner thoughts, that they were in some way his counselor or his therapist, that they could peer into his psyche and know what was really going on in his poor, troubled soul. And with this special insight that they magically have, they can tell us what Ukraine could have done that would have avoided the war, or what the West could do now that would end the conflict. If only the West would ... If only Ukraine had ... A striking number of these comments came from Twitter accounts that had fake or no profile picture, no discernible name in the bio or Twitter handle, and a vast amount of Twitter activity for a very new account. These are fairly obviously coming from bot farms located who knows where, and they have very recently switched their obsession from sending dozens of tweets per day pushing a hardline anti-vax, anti-mask position to being instant experts on foreign policy and the motivations of Vladimir Putin in general. But this line also comes from what seem to be genuine accounts and genuine people. These are people who, for whatever reason, believe that however bad Putin is, the best way to prevent him from doing harm is to give him what he wants. There's a whole argument about whether that is true. Are we in a Chamberlain letting Hitler dismember Czechoslovakia in the vain hope of avoiding war situation? Or are we in a Cuba Missile Crisis situation where statecraft can avoid a war that is possible but not certain? I'm not going to get into that argument here. I'm more interested in what Putin actually wants. Daly and Wallace, just days before the invasion in February, said that the massive build-up of Russian troops and military hardware on the border with Ukraine was, quote, clearly defensive. I'm not sure what qualifications they had to make that call, or what evidence they were using beyond wishful thinking, but that claim sure didn't age well. Along with this, Wallace and Daly have made a whole series of claims about how innocent and peaceful Putin's desires are. All he wants is his security guarantees. He feels threatened by the expansion of NATO and so on. It is striking how close these claims are to Russian propaganda aimed at the West. But are they right? One thing that I've been doing is following the media inside Russia. What is Putin telling Russians? And what is the Russian ruling elite around Putin telling itself? The first thing to understand is that almost all media consumed within Russia is utterly controlled by the Kremlin. Putin's Russia was never a great place for freedom of press to begin with, but since he returned to the presidency in 2012, there was a huge change in the level of press freedom. All media that were not already state-owned were acquired by Putin-friendly oligarchs through a pretty standard procedure. The independent newspaper, TV station or whatever would get an unsolicited buyout offer from a Putin crony for a ridiculous sum, maybe a tenth of its value. Some owners knew the score and sold up. Those who didn't immediately got a huge tax bill. The owners would be arrested for tax fraud and would either agree to sell to the crony for an even smaller fraction of the value, or go to jail on trumped-up charges and have their companies expropriated and handed over to the crony for free. The new owners were unfailingly loyal to the Kremlin, as were any journalists who wanted to keep their jobs. Some minor websites held out and danced around the law, operating increasingly from offices outside Russia, and there was even one TV station, Doherty, meaning rain, which was ordered off-air by Putin shortly after he invaded Ukraine. But even before then, their reach was insignificant. It's not comparing Nuh TGKar to RT1 News. It's more like comparing some idiot who makes a niche podcast to BBC One News. In fact, Doherty wasn't ever even on the air. It was a webcast run from a private apartment. So you'd have to go to their website with your phone or computer to see it, which is not how most people watch TV. Similarly, there are still some VPNs that allow people to get through to the now banned Western social media like Facebook and Twitter. So it's true to say that until recently, there were some media that didn't toe the Kremlin line, and that even now, it's just about possible to get alternative non-state-controlled news in Russia. It's just that it's so niche, so non-mainstream, so technically awkward that it only reaches the tiny minority who are powerfully motivated to seek it out. So, in other words, the people who are setting their views against Putin anyway. What I'm talking about here are the behemoths of Russian media. In Russia, that means the main half-dozen TV stations that are in every home, in every city and every village. The Kremlin doesn't just censor them. The Kremlin directs every political line that they take. It's not a case that their news and current affairs are presented by journalists grumpily omitting the news that Putin doesn't want broadcast. What's happening is that the editors and presenters are hardline Putin loyalists. Not a few of them are in the elite of a couple of hundred of billionaires who Putin has surrounded himself with, and whose wealth is believed to be, in fact, beneficially owned by Putin, despite being in their names, so they get a cut in return for helping him launder the many billions that he's stolen. So, at least the most senior of these commentators are not so much censored by Putin as a window into his thinking, or at least the portion of his thinking that he wants promoted to the wider Russian population. So, what is he thinking? Listener, this is terrifying. Most of his ideas come from a man called Alexander Dugin. Dugin has written a number of books, but by far the most influential was written in the mid-1990s. It's called Foundations of Geopolitics. In the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin was the drunken post-communist president of a Russia that was humiliated by the loss of the Cold War, economic collapse, and a total failure to compete with the West in culture, technology, politics, and soft power. At that time, Dugin was a member of a fringe neo-fascist group called Pamyat, which roughly translates as memory. The name is significant. It harks back to a past, somewhat imaginary, when the greatness of Russia was not in question. Like any large, inward-looking culture, Russia has an inflated sense of its own importance in world affairs, both political and cultural. I cannot overstate the influence of this book. When people say required reading, that's usually a metaphor meaning that it's important. But in this case, this book is literally required reading in the academies that every officer in the Russian military goes through. That includes all the people in the FSB, the successor of the KGB, everyone in the GRU, Russian military intelligence, including the spies caught on CCTV in Salisbury poisoning the Skripals. It includes every one of those enthusiastic TV commentators seen by millions every evening, and of course, everyone else who matters in Putin's elite. And that means that not only have they read this book, they would have been required to write essays on it, give presentations on the importance of this or that chapter of the book, pass exams proving that they understood the text. This book is to the Russian elite what some mixture of Peg Sayers, the 1916 Proclamation, and the Rosary was to generations of Irish school children. And what does it say? Basically, it is a roadmap to Russian domination of what it calls Eurasia. That's the combined continent of Europe and Asia. It regards what it calls Atlanticism, the close relationship between Western Europe and North America, as the source of all evil, and sets out to defeat it. Some of this book, along with Dugin's other works, are laughable nonsense. It supposedly charts a route of how Russia would defeat China in geopolitical terms. Bear in mind that China has about 10 times the population of Russia and a rapidly growing, technologically advanced economy. The Russian economy is stagnant and hugely overdependent on resource extraction with little or no added value. But in the plans for Western Europe, you get more engagement with reality in Dugin's books. He doesn't mention Ireland, by the way. It actually doesn't even mention Britain by name, just contemptuously refers to it as an aircraft carrier for the Americans parked off the coast of Europe. Remember that this book was written a quarter of a century ago, and its prescription for Britain is that it should be separated from the EU, and you begin to see its relevance. As to the current conflict, its analysis of Ukraine is savage. Here's a portion translated for Wikipedia. Ukraine as a state has no geopolitical meaning, no particular cultural import or universal significance, no geographical uniqueness, no ethnic exclusiveness. Its certain territorial ambitions represent an enormous danger for all of Eurasia. The book goes on to make clear that the most urgent project is, quote, resolving the Ukrainian problem. It's worth noting here the parallels with an article that appeared on the website RIA Novosti, the Russian state news agency, at the start of April. This article explicitly calls for the erasure of the Ukrainian nation. It says that the majority of Ukrainians are Nazis. It uses the terms denazification and de-Ukrainization interchangeably. And it says the elite of Ukrainian society and all members of its military must be liquidated, that is, murdered. It says that the entire Ukrainian cultural heritage must be erased, and that the general population of Ukraine deserve the most severe horrors of war because they allowed a Nazi government into power and those that survive must be subjugated to decades of forced re-education. To be clear, that bit's not Dugin. That's an article published on a Russian government website this month, and it's still online as of the time of recording. Dugin, in his book, explicitly says that Ukraine should not be allowed to remain independent, and his justification for this is essentially the denial not only of the legitimacy of Ukraine as a country or as a nation, but what he clearly regards as the inferior, subhuman status of Ukrainians in general. It's also notable that statements by both Putin and his Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov since the invasion have echoed these sentiments almost word for word. In an interview in 2014, around the time Russia seized Crimea from Ukraine, Dugin gave an interview saying of Ukrainians, "What we see is beyond any limits. Kill them, kill them, kill them. There should not be any more conversations." I'll say a bit more about Dugin's belief system in a moment, but briefly, his book sets out a vision of Europe and Asia where some countries are wiped out, like Ukraine, and others are allowed to remain as client states. Finland, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Latvia and Lithuania in the West are all taken over by Russia, as are the former Central Asian Soviet republics of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, along with Mongolia. After that, there's a lot of giving one country to another. Estonia, for some bizarre logic based on ethnic prejudice, is to be given to Germany, which would also get France and by implication the remaining Mediterranean countries. Iran would be given Azerbaijan as some sort of gift to make Iran into an ally of Moscow, and Turkey would not be conquered but kept weak by fueling ethnic conflicts. Similarly, Dugin doesn't seek to conquer the United States, just weaken it by, quote, introducing geopolitical disorder into internal American activity, encouraging all kinds of separatism and ethnic, social and racial conflicts, actively supporting all dissent movements, extremist, racist and sectarian groups, thus destabilizing internal political processes in the US. It would also make sense to simultaneously support isolationist tendencies in American politics. Again, the wiki translation there. And how is all this to be done? Dugin sees hot war as a last resort. His primary tool is subversion, destabilization, and spreading disinformation in the target countries. He advocates the establishment of dedicated special services to run these operations in the West. This book was published 25 years ago, remember, and he writes explicitly that the Russian government, at the time on its knees in the post-Soviet chaos, should dedicate huge resources to supporting groups that it has nothing in common with, just to undermine society, to spread disinformation, and to do everything else it can to destabilize Western democracies. And what sort of government does Dugin envisage? Helpfully, he's written a book about that too. It's called The Fourth Political Theory. The first three political theories that refers to are democracy, communism, and fascism. To understand why he calls his ideology the fourth theory, it helps to understand the enormous cultural and psychological role that fascism, the fight against it, the Second World War, what they still call the Great Patriotic War, have in Russia. Think how big World War II is in American culture. The role that Hitler and fascism play today as a bogeyman in political discourse. How Nazi Germany is used as a shorthand for almost anything negative. Then consider that the US lost about 500,000 men in combat in World War II. Then consider that the Soviet Union lost 26 million men in combat in World War II, along with uncountable civilians. However bad the label fascism is in Anglo-American culture, it's literally 50 times worse in Russian culture. That's why preposterously labeling the Jewish president of Ukraine, most of whose family were murdered in the Holocaust, as a Nazi is so important in Russian propaganda, regardless of the cost to their own credibility. Dugin's ideology advocates intensely chauvinistic and racist policies. It is contemptuous of democracy, of international law regarding the sovereignty of nations, and of any notion of human rights. He doesn't really have any coherent economic policy other than having a strongman leader of Russia and allowing that strongman to dole out economic goodies as he sees fit. He's okay with private enterprise, but not with free markets. Everything must be under control of the strong leader. There is only one reason why Dugin distinguishes his ideas from fascism, and that is the taboo nature of fascism in post-war Russian culture. It's an overused term, but Dugin's ideas are as fascist as the Nazis. Applied to Russia, all of his ideas are fundamentally identical to Hitler's as they applied to Germany. But Dugin is no rabble-rousing demagogue. He's a university professor in Moscow. He supplies the ideas, the ideology. The demagoguery is outsourced to his student, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. In a moment, we'll have that interview with Michael Doherty, PRO of the Micah Action Group. But first, I want to say thank you to all of my donors on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates there. It's a web service that allows you to donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month to keep us going, keep us on the air. And that helps us to devote more time to researching topics to talk about and finding interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same as those donors, there's details on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
I'm possibly not the only person who heard of Formica before I heard of mica. Formica is a resin, a sort of plastic artificial material that's used to make floor coverings and kitchen tops. It was particularly popular in the 1970s, but its name comes from mica, a mineral found in lots of rocks. Formica was supposed to be a cheaper alternative that gave the same rock grain look but was cheaper. Its name comes literally from Formica instead of mica. Sort of, I can't believe it's not mica. But for some people, I think they would have preferred if it really wasn't mica, and I have one of them on the line now. Michael Doherty, you are the PRO of the Micah Action Group. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And why does your group exist?
Well, our group exists because we have got thousands of crumbling homes in Donegal. We're in existence for about 10 years now. It started off when we noticed that our newly built homes had what looked like extensive settlement cracks, and then it got progressively worse over the early years to the point where we started to get concerned about it. We brought in then structural engineers. We paid for our own testing to be done, and lo and behold, we had something that we'd never heard of before, this mineral called mica. And in some cases in the west coast of Ireland, Mayo, for example, we also have the same issue, only it would be more predominantly pyrite. And since all of that in the last couple of years, we have learned that there's other deleterious materials over and above mica and pyrite with equally devastating effects, and perhaps more, the likes of pyrrhotite. And the effect is that it basically causes our concrete blocks to turn into what we would refer to as Weetabix blocks. You can physically catch these blocks with your hand, catch the corners of the blocks, and just pull a piece off and just rumble it about in your hand, and it'll drop onto the ground like gravel. And that's what's holding up our houses at the moment.
Okay, and do I understand the physical process correctly, that this mineral clearly should not be in the blocks, but that it is absorbing water and therefore expanding and causing this crumbling? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, there's various mechanisms. First of all, I think it's important to understand that mica is a natural occurring mineral, as is pyrite and pyrrhotite and the others. These are not additives or anything by the manufacturers. This is naturally occurring in the blocks themselves. But there's standards around them. There's the statutory instrument of 1948 would have said that you shouldn't have more than 1% mica in your blocks, and yet we have found and tested blocks at 36% mica and so on as well. So it's a natural occurring mineral. It just shouldn't be in the levels that we had in our blocks. That them particular areas, the quarries should not have been quarried, and the crushed rock should never have made their way into blocks. But yes, there's several mechanisms. One of them, and some of them I would say, still not fully understood. We do know that it will absorb water, and you've got freeze-thaw action taking place, and that was believed to be the predominant failure mechanism. But there has been other examples.
Roll that back there, because the listeners might not have caught that. What's called freeze-thaw action. And I think everybody knows that when water freezes, it expands slightly. So if you've got some water in the block, that water freezes, expands slightly, damages the block, then maybe in the daytime thaws again, so it goes smaller, but water fills up those cracks which have been expanded, freezes again, expands a little bit more, and progressively destroys the block. Is that what we're talking about there?
Yes, that's what's happening, yeah. So that is one of the mechanisms, but it's certainly not the only mechanism, because we know, for example, we have got internal walls within our house as well as the external walls also cracking. And, the inside of most houses is never going to see freezing conditions. So there has to be other mechanisms. And we know now, for example, that we've got moisture can also, for example, bathroom walls, kitchen walls, we'll find also tend to go first as well inside the houses. And then we've got various combinations of pyrite, pyrrhotite, and mica. And all of these three between them, seem to require different conditions in order to become active. And there is a massive study required around this that we believe hasn't been instigated. But what we do know is that when we tapped into Europe, there has been extensive studies done there. And they would probably claim the pyrrhotite is the biggest killer of them all. But certainly in the early days of our campaign, mica was the only one that we were aware of, and therefore the brand sort of built itself around mica alone, but it's really any of the deleterious materials in defective concrete blocks. That's what's causing our problems at the moment. Okay,
that's the physical problem with the structure. I'm more interested maybe in what's happening to people like you, and I think there's about 5,000 homes between Donegal and Mayo that have been identified that have this problem. How has that affected you? How has that affected your family and the other people in your group?
Well, I suppose as a campaigner and others before me as well, because I haven't been in from the very beginning, but I've been in for the most of it. It basically has put our lives on hold. If you can imagine a situation yourself where you're in a situation you have built your and we did build, as this was my forever home. This was built on my granny's land. It was in our name for generations before that. I had built this house with the intention of passing that to my grandchildren and to their grandchildren. So everything was done right from the off. We bought what we thought was the best of the blocks that were available. This was a self-built home. And we did all the right things, and now if I get another Christmas out of this house, that'll be the end of it. That'll be as much as it can take, because it's fairly well bursted up at this stage. I've got bison slabs in there. In other words, my first floor is all made of concrete as opposed to timber joists. So I have probably 300 or 400 ton of concrete being supported by these blocks, and they're just getting to the point where we just can't really take a chance and live here any longer. And so we were very aware when we went through our last Christmas, it was probably going to be the last in this particular house, which is difficult to get your head around. And I'm only one of what we now believe to be about 7,000 families. in Donegal alone, and we've got probably another 2,000 in Mayo. So the numbers keep increasing because the reality
I got that figure from the expert group report. You were saying that has since increased. You've identified more homes. Tell me, just from a point of view of you personally, family life, what's the impact?
Yeah. Well, most of my evenings will be spent with the campaign, and that can be 5 to 7 days a week. We're all the time in negotiations with government, with senior officials in the departments, the civil servants, and then the local authorities, homeowners that are looking for support and help. We've got pensioners that, don't even know how to start the process of applying for the scheme. Mm-hmm. There is no liaison officers appointed, so it's really our voluntary organisation that fills that gap. So it's been all-consuming. And, the other smaller bits that people never think about is you don't have any interest in, painting your house or doing anything up in your house. Our house has been in a sort of a Michael limbo for about 7 or 8 years now, mm-hmm. because we kept thinking that, next year maybe the scheme will be good enough and we can apply and afford to replace our home. It never really works out, and you just stretch everything onwards and onwards. And, our kids are now at a stage where I have two will be coming out the other side of university next year. I have another guy doing his leaving cert, another guy's a transition year. And, they have known nothing really other than Micah over the last 7 years. You'd be embarrassed to bring people to your home, mm-hmm. A home that you were extremely proud of when you built. And you thought it was there for generations, like I said. It got to the point where you didn't even want to bring people around because it was almost felt like, an embarrassment.
Yeah, and you mentioned there the scheme. What exactly mm-hmm. is the scheme? What does it do, and who's paying for it?
So the scheme, after a lot of campaigning over the years, we eventually got a defective concrete block scheme announced in January 2020. Mm-hmm. It was then subject to administrative detail through the department, and was probably around May or June whenever it was opened up to the public. Now, it was meant to be a 90-10 scheme, as we called it. We wanted 100% redress because we felt it was absolutely no, and it has been confirmed. There's no fault to the homeowner here. It's not a case of self-build or contractors, or because we already have it in hospitals, we have it in schools, we have it in libraries, mm-hmm. we have it in the county council offices themselves.
Yeah. So when you say 100% redress, that essentially means the taxpayer picking up the tab for the entire cost of repair, or I think in most cases rebuild of the houses in question.
Yes, correct. Because how we came into this scenario was during our Celtic Tiger times. The state adopted a light touch regulation approach to the quarries. In other words, we will trust you to do the right thing here, and that didn't happen. And we bought our blocks in good faith, or we bought our houses built with blocks in good faith, and the state let us down. That's the bottom line. And
okay,
we're in a situation where we end up paying for our houses twice.
Pause on that for a moment, because I can see that it is blindingly obvious that you've been the victim of a monstrous injustice, that you built your own house, as you say yourself, on a family site. Other people would have bought houses in housing estates and so forth. And mm-hmm. I can see that that's something that would be enormously stressful, especially when it's in your own home. It's very, very difficult to get away from. Mm-hmm. But I don't quite see how the taxpayer is on the hook for this, because people do lose money on various things, sometimes through foolishness, sometimes through no fault of their own. And I'm not sure why, in every case, taxpayers aren't picking up the tab, or why that, why should that happen in one case and not another? I would have thought, just from the description, that what you're talking about is civil liability, that you should hopefully have someone to sue, although a lot of people who've been the victim of an injustice through defective products or whatever end up not having anyone to sue. But explain to me the moral reason why the taxpayer should pick up the tab.
Well, we have already explored everything else and exhausted everything else. We first of all went after the quarries in question. There's one quarry responsible for about 90% of it. There was no support for that whatsoever. We were actually told they didn't have an insurance that would allow us to claim off them. We looked at home bond.
But roll back.
At the banks.
Did you sue?
No. Well, who was going to take on the monster that we had? Because a homeowner that was already going to have to try to replace their home, whereas now we don't have class action. We were going to be in a situation where someone was going to have to take on the state or take on the quarries. We tried to take on the quarries. Mm-hmm. We were there's homeowners that have been out 40 and 50,000 on legal costs so far, and then they had to abandon it. They just couldn't take it on because the machine of the big business and the concrete federations and so on. It was just we were on a hiding to nothing.
But just factually to establish for the listeners, those quarries, which sometimes are small businesses, sometimes I think can be also a part of very large businesses, they have not been sued and they haven't taken a financial hit for supplying products that are clearly enormously defective and have caused enormous loss.
Yes, this is true.
Yeah, can you understand how the average person paying their PAYE tax will be outraged by that? I'm not suggesting it's your fault, but the fact that the taxpayer is picking up the tab and that the people who caused the problem are getting away scot-free, that really is outraging, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, the bottom line that everybody has to remember, these 7,000 homeowners I'm talking about are all taxpayers as well, mm-hmm. equally taxpayers, the same as anybody else in the country. Mm-hmm. And we went after government. We have no problem and would actually encourage government to go after the quarries, but mm-hmm. we're too small to do that. We can't do that on our own. And we need government to step in, and the argument about the taxpayer, I'll go back to the billions that in the bank bailouts. Did anybody ask the taxpayer, was that okay? They just went ahead and done it. We had
hold on for a second, Michael. Okay, go ahead and then I'll come back.
We've got the Children's Hospital, mm-hmm. which ran into billions of an overrun as well. Mm-hmm. I didn't hear anybody say that it wasn't the right thing to do to bail them out. That's how things work. Like if we go down this road here, where do we stop? We've got people in Donegal and Mayo and other affected counties. There's 6 affected counties so far and more yet to be discovered. And what we're trying to do here is establish a template and establish a precedent that whoever in this country this happens to, that someone has to be accountable and it can't be left to the homeowner. It has been left to the homeowner in Donegal. We have fought the fight that everybody will benefit from because there's even in Skerries now, we're talking about defective concrete blocks as well. This is getting close to the capital. Mm-hmm. And, I've no doubt there'll be a different approach. We've already seen that different approach in the Leinster Pyrite scheme because we've got a precedent to this. It was Pyrite and Leinster Pyrite scheme. That was 100% redress. It was end-to-end contract management by the state through the housing agency. And why would it be any different for homeowners because we're in rural Ireland, stuck up in Donegal or on the western seaboard? The precedent is already in place and it needs to be followed through. And this discriminatory approach that we've got exactly the same problem. It's just pyrite as opposed to mica. And you've got a completely different approach adopted by government. We just are not prepared to accept that.
Oh, okay. One thing that I want to say is that I think you have a very strong case for one particular reason, because in 1993, up to 1993, we had an organisation, a state body called the Institute for Industrial Research and Standards. And what they did was they went around and testing various different products that were being produced, including concrete blocks, and they made the decision as to whether the product came up to scratch or not. Pádraig Flynn, who was, let's say, best known for taking bribes from people not entirely unassociated with the building industry, as a minister, he abolished that institute, and I think you averted to it earlier. He moved to what was called light touch regulation, which is often a euphemism for no regulation at all. But I do want to look at the moral question on this. And parallel to that, we had, for example, deregulation of financial markets, particularly allowing maybe smaller people to buy shares, whereas previously that was very much a practice that was done by a small number of people who were very well educated in terms of financial planning. People then who were perhaps less expert were able to buy in, and people bought, for example, AIB shares, Anglo-Irish Bank shares as well. They lost everything. They were cleaned out. There were people who lost their houses because they had lost investments there. There were people who lost essentially their pensions and so forth, and nobody bailed them out. And actually, I think that's correct, because we do need to have an element of moral hazard here, whereby people who choose to make a decision in a marketplace must live with the results of that decision. I presume, Michael, you're not saying that every time I lose a fiver by backing the wrong horse in a race that the government should step in and give me the fiver back. But where would you draw the line there if you're saying that not 90% but 100% of the cost of rebuilding every one of those homes must be borne by the taxpayer?
Yeah, well, for starters, there was nobody backing horses here. You would have said safest houses.
No, I use that. No, but there was people who put their whole pension pot in what they were told were safest houses, AIB shares, and lost everything.
Yeah, that's okay. And was there guarantees? We had guarantees that we understood was in place in terms of consumer protection when we would buy a product. The reality was you have more of a guarantee buying a toaster than you have building a house. There is no one regulating this. We highlighted in 2014 to government that there was a massive problem looming here, and we weren't taken on. They ignored us. And most of the cost that this was going to now be borne by the taxpayer would have been avoided if they had listened to us at the time. So they didn't listen to us. They continued to enjoy the high taxes and VAT receipts they were getting from the construction industry using defective blocks from quarries. And, despite being told, they continued to do so. We had no option. We had no recourse. That we had to go back to government and say, right, okay, so you have continued to allow these quarries to operate. We're not big enough to take on the quarries, but we are demanding you as a state do something about it. And that was the case we fought. And we ended up being vindicated in that approach in the fact that there was a scheme announced. Our problem with the scheme was that they then messed about with the terms and conditions, and something that was workable, potentially, it was made not workable. And we were still going to be out, in most cases, about €100,000 on average. And, I would say anybody listening to this, it's fine to take the approach that says, why would the taxpayer pay? But imagine you're in a situation where you've done nothing wrong. I have never had one day's dole money in my life. My wife has never had a day's dole money in her life. Our 4 kids were through university, paid for not by the state or through grants, but by us, our savings after we've paid all our taxes. And the one thing that you thought you had was your home. And I'm in a situation at 55 years of age where I'll probably have to go out now, and instead of looking forward to retiring in the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, I'm now going to have to look to see where I can find €100,000 to put along with a government grant to replace the house that I've already paid for. I had 2 years left on my mortgage. So that's fine. I understand people sitting back with a cup of tea listening to that. But imagine it was you. Imagine you're sitting there and you've got a letter through the door that says your test results come back and your house must be demolished. And you look into it and you find out that you're going to have to find up to €100,000 to put along with this so-called grant to replace what you're already living in.
What's the quantum? Michael, what's the quantum? You said about 7,000 houses. What is the total cost? Do all of them have to be entirely rebuilt? And what's the average cost? What amount of money can I multiply by 7,000 to just work out what's the total loss here?
Well, it's already been determined by the department. They estimate about a €2.2 billion scheme. That's what it's going to cost over the next 15 years.
Okay. Can you understand that there are people in Ireland where we have a very, very serious housing problem and housing shortage and people living in very unsuitable and cramped conditions? And if the government had, let's say, 2.2 billion that it found down the back of a couch, can you understand that they might say, well, hang on a second, there's these 5,000 or 7,000, whatever the number is, of families who we can rebuild their houses, in some cases, fairly modest houses, in some cases, pretty impressive houses? Or would you spend that on alleviating homelessness, perhaps prioritizing, at least to a degree, people who are in very serious need? Can you see how that there is competition for that money, and it's not immediately obvious that your cause, which I'm not doubting, and I know that it's a very serious issue, but can you see how they wouldn't immediately see that you should have priority on that?
I think we've obviously not been prioritised because we're 10 years. We're 10 years on the road here, and we've got 5 houses fixed so far. So nobody could say we're a priority. What I would say very clearly
but there is something like 2.2 billion committed there, isn't there? There is.
Okay. Yeah, over 15 years. Over 15 years, right? Mm-hmm. So, let's just strip this back a little bit. We have no beef with anybody that has a housing crisis out there of a different nature to what we have here. All we know is that we have done nothing wrong. Our lives have been on hold for 10 years. We have absolutely nowhere else to go. We informed government in 2014, and despite that, they spent 8 years building defective homes, thousands of homes built with defective materials, because they wouldn't listen to us. Mm-hmm. And why would they not listen to us? This is where all the conspiracy theories and talk of corruption and everything else plays into it. Why would I or the other 7,000 homeowners that are along with us sit back and say, okay, because there's bigger fish to fry, perhaps in somebody else's world, that we're just going to roll over and live with a complete injustice? Now, they can find money, and that's the bottom line. Well, COVID has taught us that. COVID has taught us that they can find money. COVID has taught us that regards all their regulations and protocol, with a stroke of a pen, they can make amazing things happen. We have got the absolute, really heart-wrenching Ukraine situation at the moment. And I went last night over to our local Gaelic club, where we are inviting Ukrainians into our area to see what we can do to help them. But we've seen that there's 4 billion can be committed in the space of a month. So there's money to be found when they believe that it justifies it. What has been heart-wrenching for us is the fact that they have never seemed to recognise what we're living with in Donegal is equally.
Can I pause you there for a moment? And I take on board what you're saying, Michael. I take on board what you're saying, and that you feel that your place in the queue is justified. And I don't want to diminish that at all. And I don't want to diminish the very real social effects of that, or stress. And when it's happening in your own home, that's something that's particularly stressful. It's not possible to get away from. But I just note in what you said that there's sort of, and I don't know if it's a defensiveness that's to do with, let's say, the BMW areas, the border Midlands and West, and you talk about being in Donegal and calling it a discriminatory approach. And you're saying that there's no doubt there would be a different approach if it was in Dublin. I mean, in Dublin, there is a particularly acute accommodation crisis. There is, and I can tell you examples of people living with children in bed and breakfast accommodation where they have to be out of the house for the whole of the day, which on school days is one thing, but on non-school days is another, where you have children trying to do homework all the way up through their junior cert and leaving cert.
Yeah, I watched the news as well.
Yeah, yes. Okay. And what I really just want to ask you about is, and we've discussed, David McWilliams did the calculations of huge amounts of transfers of wealth, which are typically from Dublin area to the periphery, to the other counties in the country. It is notable that there is a particular set of problems that crop up in the BMW areas, and Donegal, maybe being the most remote from Dublin, has it, that these problems are to do with non-compliance and essentially lawlessness at some level, and you've been a victim of it very clearly, of this these substandard blocks being done. And if you look at other statistics such as road deaths or whatever, there's enormous variation across the country. Is there something about, and I don't want to particularly single out Donegal, but you're in Donegal, is there something about those places that are remote from Dublin that people have a habit of saying, sure, you don't need to bother paying attention to the rules, and then that comes back and bites people on the ass?
Well, certainly there was no homeowners that said, sure, anything will do. Mm-hmm. We bought blocks in good faith. That's the bottom line. Or we bought our houses in good faith. Just as people in Dublin and the rest of the country bought blocks and houses in good faith. There was no shortcuts taken here. None
Sure.
whatsoever.
No, I
I
appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Anything will do. It wasn't a case of that in the slightest.
But the quarry owners were saying that, weren't they?
Yeah, but that there were regulations that were meant to be enforced that weren't enforced. That's the bottom line. The consumer was not protected the way the consumer ought to have been protected. Mm-hmm. The state were responsible for that, and the state need to set that right. And
but the people like the person who is number one responsible for this is P. Flynn, who abolished that Institute for Industrial Research and Standards, which would have caught this and nipped it in the bud and meant that this problem would not have happened. He was the archetype of the BMW type politician who says, Yerisha, don't be bothering to what those people up above in Dublin are saying. And he used that with a nod and a wink, which did well for him electorally. And then you use that essentially against the people who elected him. He was a Mayo politician. And I'm just wondering about that particular effect, that this type of populist politician who can use that anti-Dublin feeling, which you have expressed in what you're saying there, can actually use that against his own electorate and enrich himself along the line. That's a failing in our political system, isn't it?
Well, I don't think I've expressed an anti-Dublin feeling.
You did. You said, Michael, you did. You said that it was discrimination and that it wouldn't have happened to people in Dublin.
Yeah, that's not anti-Dublin. Let's be very clear. The people in Dublin were absolutely within their rights to get 100% redress for defective products that was used to build their home. Mm-hmm. My problem is that we're being treated with less than that. They were absolutely right. I have no beef with what happened in Dublin. My beef is at the fact that the same rules and resolutions are not being applied outside of Dublin when it comes to Donegal. Mm-hmm. That's where my problem lies. I have no problem with the Dublin people or what was done to them because they had an injustice and that injustice was put right. That was the right thing to do.
You've expressed that, Michael. You've expressed that very clearly, and I take note of that. The listeners will have heard that very clearly. But address my point that there is a political cuteness that exploits anti-Dublin feeling in some areas of the country, and the Healy-Rays perhaps are the archetypes of this these days, that essentially then goes on to exploit that anti-Dublin populism in order to harm the interests of people like you and the people you represent.
I don't know. To be honest, it's not my bag. I'm an ordinary homeowner. I'm campaigning on behalf of ordinary homeowners that have been affected by that. Once we get into the intricacies of cuteness and in terms of politicians and what they're doing and their that's not what I'm about. It's not what I'm here to be interviewed about. I want to be talking about the simple fact that we have got, through no fault of our own, homes crumbling down around us, and we still have not got a scheme that's fit for purpose, that 10 years later we have got our lives on hold. That's our problem. We have got pensioners here in their 70s, in their 80s, that are now spent the last 10 years wondering where they're going to live next because they don't see how they've no earning potential because they're on state pensions, and yet these people are left with a shortfall, and it leaves them that they just cannot avail of anything that the government's offering. That's what I want to talk about. That's what the problem is here. This is not about Dublin versus anywhere else. This is simply a case of a humanitarian crisis that's happening in Donegal, again, through no fault of our own, and we're just not getting the resolutions that's required. We had the Taoiseach up last weekend. We were strongly encouraged by that for the first time, but he needs to follow through on it. We're now in a stage where we're going to have legislation passing through very shortly on this so-called enhanced scheme, and it needs to deliver 100% redress for these innocent homeowners that need a pathway forward. That's it for me.
Michael, I can appreciate that is something that is enormously difficult for families who are living with that problem, and it's literally visible inside their house as they try to go to sleep every night. I very much appreciate you talking to me, Michael Doherty of the Micah Action Group in Donegal.
Thank you.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show. And while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter @Here's How Podcast, and follow the Micah Action Group @Micah Action Group. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate €1 or €2 per podcast or per month, please do go to patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website, and also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All of that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.